This is Colorado Public Radio News. I'm Andrea Dukakis. We've been covering the rash of gang-related deaths in Denver, a dozen so far this year. It has residents on edge, particularly in the northeast part of the city. Police have stepped up patrols and added surveillance cameras. We want to take a step back now and learn more about gang culture. Lisa Taylor Austin is a therapist who's worked with some of the most notorious gangs in Los Angeles and elsewhere. She's also an expert court witness on gangs. Lisa, thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
We've seen an uptick in gang violence in Denver lately, and this is an issue that also flares up in other parts of Colorado, in Aurora, in the prison system, for example. Is this spate of gang violence we're experiencing now unique compared to the rest of the country?
I don't think so. We see ebbs and flows of gang activity at different periods of time. Sometimes it spikes and other times, there's a lull. And, there's various factors that contribute to that.
Yeah, what leads to the rise in gangs in some communities or gang violence?
Well, the rise in gang violence can be people who are in prison systems. For example, if there's a large gang sweep and you incarcerate a large number of gang members and they're off the street, you might see a lull at that point. And then when they get released, you might see increased activity. There can also be increased activity when there's different discrepancies going on between various gangs over turf, retaliation shootings. I also see that in areas that have military bases, there can be an increase in gang activity when recruits come in because some recruits actually are gang members and they bring the gang activity onto the base.
And just generally, what leads to the rise in gangs in some communities? Why are they there? What are the reasons folks join gangs?
That's a really good question because I think, when we just look at how the media portrays gangs, we see all the negative outcomes of gang activity. And there are a lot of negative outcomes, people getting murdered, people going to jail, people, losing their families. But gangs also serve a purpose for people. Most people join gangs when they're young, between the ages of maybe 8 and 20, somewhere in there.
That young.
Yes. And I think that for the people joining when they're young, the gang serves a purpose for them. So there's a push-pull factor. People are pushed into gangs maybe because of family dysfunction, and people are pulled into gangs because of the lure of what the gang offers. So what I've seen as a psychotherapist is a lot of young people who have very dysfunctional families. Maybe, parents are deceased. They might have died of AIDS from, using drugs or something of that nature. And now you have, an 11-year-old who doesn't have any parents and doesn't have a family and is now in the system. And so a gang, in their eyes at that point in time, provides a family for them and a sense of belonging. And so from the gang member's perspective, the gang actually is serving a purpose for them. It isn't just killing, robbing, and maiming, although gangs do that as well.
So it's sort of, in many ways, filling a void in these kids' lives.
I think so. I think for young people it is. The average period of time that a young gang member stays in a gang is only about 2 years. So, I think that we have the perception that once you're in a gang, you're in a gang forever. And for some people, that's true. For some gang members, that's true. But for many of the young people who join, they're either being pushed out of school, let's say, and they're too young to really go work and find a job. They're looking for a place to belong. It's very interesting. I worked for 25 years in schools, K-12, and also universities. I think that many schools, not all schools, but many schools see gang members as students they don't really want there. I think oftentimes schools are really looking for ways to get rid of these students. And my philosophy was always, these are our students, we serve them, and whatever need they have, we have to look at how to fill that. If they're committing, problems at school, what's the reason for that? Is it because they have a learning disability? Is it because, there's rival gang activity going on that needs to be addressed? Is there a disinterest in school because they don't see how an education is really going to be beneficial to them?
Some people associate gangs with crime. What do they do? What holds them together as a unit?
Well, I think it depends on the type of gang that we're talking about. Some gangs exist for a cohesive family unit type structure, and they might do very low-level crimes. Then there's other gangs, entrepreneurial gangs, that exist to make money, and their sole purpose is to be very lucrative, and what holds them together is the business of their crime. Mm-hmm. There's other gangs that are multi-generational, and they have been around, from the 1800s. And, you'll have the son and then the father and then the grandfather and the great-grandfather. They were all gang members.
You've counseled gang members, former gang members. What are some of the things these gang members tell you about why they became violent?
I recall a young man telling me about how his father took him outside in the front yard and was beating him up and took his head and smashed it into the driveway, several times. So I find that there's people with pretty severe dysfunction in their family. In some cities, there's gang wars based on what side of the city you're from or which street you're from. And so there's a very long-standing history of gang wars that have existed for many, many years. And I've asked young people, do you know why you hate them? Oh, we just hate them. That's the way it's always been. But they don't know the history behind it.
Is it sort of a turf fight, or do they want to retain the blocks that they have or the space that they have, gain more ground? What are they fighting over?
It can be especially in urban areas. In urban areas, like a place like, Los Angeles or Denver, there's very specific boundaries of turf and claim on a turf. In other areas, like in rural areas, you don't really see that whole turf war going on.
But you do see gangs in rural areas, too?
Absolutely.
What we're seeing in Denver right now is violence of African Americans against other African Americans. Is that something you see a lot?
Yes. And, I think that the history of America plays into that. I think what happens is that through many different avenues, people in urban areas, African American people in urban areas, are oppressed. They don't have the options that many of us have in suburbia. There isn't a sense of hope. I've talked to kids who've never even left the boundaries of a 4-block radius. They don't even know that there's another life out there that they could possibly have. When you have oppression of a people, they tend to turn inward on each other.
I want to play you some tape from Reverend Leon Kelly. He's an anti-gang activist in Denver, and he was on our show last week. He says one possible cause of increased gang violence is gentrification in Denver's northeast neighborhoods.
Now that we see this new flow of folks coming in, buying property, and seeing like property value over in that neighborhood has really skyrocketed or gone up. It's compressing some of these guys who feel like they're losing their identities.
Can the influx of wealthier people into poorer neighborhoods spark an increase in gang violence?
I think it can, because it pushes the boundaries or the perceived turf, north, south, east, or west. So it could actually push one gang member's turf into another gang member's turf.
In Denver, we've read press reports of several gangs that are alleged to be active right now. The Bloods, Crips, Sureños, Gangster Disciples. How did these gangs get to Colorado in the first place? What's the history?
I think that, it depends on the gang. There's a number of different factors. I think there has been a migration over the years of people moving from Mexico to Denver, and some of those people have connections to the Mexican mafia. Sureños have a connection to the Mexican mafia. I've also seen over the years a migration of people moving from the Los Angeles area to the Denver area. Mm-hmm. And when people move, what happens is that they bring with them the things that they did in the old places where they lived. I've also seen situations where a family might move to a new area and they have a young person in their family, maybe 12 years old. That person gets to the new area and says, hey, I can kind of reinvent myself here because no one knows me. And I was exposed to gangs, in Los Angeles. So let me come here and now start my own gang. And if I tell people I'm from Los Angeles, I have some credibility.
Some people would say members of gangs just can't be saved. Lock them up, put them in prison. What's your view on that?
I think it depends on the gang member. If a person wants to have another choice or have another life, they're open to change, and change is always possible. If a person is dead set on living their life as a gang member, committing crimes, and living their life incarcerated, very little can be done to help them. So I think it depends on the motivation of the individual.
I've heard that if you're in a gang in prison, it's very hard to get out. You're kind of stuck. What about outside? Is it hard for kids or anyone who's been in a gang to decide to leave it?
People can leave, and people do leave and move on. Gangs that are much more violent, like MS-13, which has ties, to Central America, that would be a gang that would be extremely difficult to leave. So it depends on the type of gang and the person's level of knowledge of gang intelligence. The more someone knows, the harder it is to leave.
Lisa, thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much.
Lisa Taylor Austin is an expert witness in gang cases and a counselor to gang members. I'm Andrea Dukakis with CPR News.